Stanford University.
So today, as part of the Going Underground series, I'm going to talk to you about how to dispose of spent nuclear fuel. I've advised the DOE that I don't like this term. They should adopt Mercedes' term. It should be called previously owned fuel. And then everybody would look on it better. And the focus here is not going to be on nuclear energy. That's another talk. But just on what to do about the fuel. But it is necessary to say a few things about what the issues are in nuclear energy and what the people who oppose its spread have to say. They say it's too expensive, they say it's not safe, and they say we don't know what to do with the fuel. Well, the last part is what I'm going to talk about today, but is it too expensive? Well, France gets 80% of its electricity from nuclear reactors and has the lowest cost electricity in Europe. It's not going to be so cheap here. We haven't built a reactor in 30 years. And so we're going to have to get the infrastructure back again. But it's certainly quite inexpensive when you get it up and running. Safe? In the whole history of the nuclear business, there have been 3 accidents. 3 Mile Island, our own accident. Thanks to the design of a reactor and its containment building, very little radiation got off site. The worst of them all was Chernobyl. Chernobyl in a kind of reactor that in the Western world was never allowed because of the very problem that caused the Chernobyl accident. That reactor can become unstable in one little corner of its operating space. And for reasons that we'll never really understand, the operators deliberately took it into that space. We know they did it because the logbook survived, although the operators didn't. That's been our worst nuclear accident. Fukushima, the more recent one, is something in between. The experts say it's about 10% of Chernobyl. But if you take all of these accidents and compare them with the hazards from fossil fuels like coal, you find that nuclear is benign. However, this is a tough sell. People fear what they can't control, and people fear most things which have very big consequences, even if they're rather rare. If you travel, probably the most frightening thing is an airplane crash. But airplanes happen to be, per passenger mile, the safest form of travel. The worst is motorcycles, but the next worst is walking. We don't worry about walking because we feel we're in control. And if we walk in the crosswalks and we obey the stoplights, we'll all be okay. But there are all those crazy people who run stoplights and hit people in crosswalks and all the rest of that. So the other thing that we talk about is greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the reasons for nuclear, not all of them, is greenhouse gas emissions. This is life cycle emissions for various electricity generating technologies. And what life cycle emissions means is it means building the power plant, including manufacturing the cement, the steel, what have you, putting it up, digging up the fuel, transporting it, using it, disposing of the waste, dismantling, all the rest of it. Those are life cycles, and the lowest are nuclear, hydro, and wind and geothermal. Coal is the worst of these things, and so environmentally it's pretty good, and that's one of the reasons some favor it. Let me get on to what the topic of this is, and you should consider the title of this slide. Whether you love nuclear or hate nuclear, we have nuclear and we have spent nuclear fuel. We have 60,000 tons of it now from our existing power reactors, and we're going to get another 60,000 tons of it from those reactors during the course of the rest of their lifetime. Disposal costs are already built in to nuclear power. Every kilowatt hour of nuclear power generated has a surcharge of 1/10 of a cent, and that 1/10 of a cent goes to the US Treasury to build up the Nuclear Waste Fund, which has got $20 billion in it now, and $10 billion of that has been used on Yucca Mountain, and we'll come back to that in a bit. After tossing away that much money, if you wanted to go on, you might have to increase the disposal cost tax to 0.15 cents per kilowatt hour. It's negligible, barely noticeable. Now, let me say a word about the nuclear fuel cycle, because this goes into the disposal issue. Natural uranium has got 0.7% of uranium-235 in it, and U-235 is fissionable. The big bulk, U-238, is not fissionable. It's the U-235, and you have to enrich the fuel to get up to about, these days, all right, it's her power, it's her thing, not mine. What do I do?
What?
It's a Mac.
Is it your computer?
It's our presentation.
It's our
computer.
presentation computer. Okay.
Shutting down, shutting down. I'm going to keep on talking, okay? While they try and fix this, let me shift over a little bit. So you got to enrich it from 0.7% to 4.5%. If you read the newspapers, you know everybody's concerned about Iran's centrifuge program. That centrifuge program is so that they can enrich their own fuel and they don't have to rely on these bums in the West. Fuel spends about 4 years in the reactor. And after 4 years, out it comes. And the spent fuel that comes out first has to go into a pool of water. It's still generating a lot of power. When you push the scram button and run all the control rods in to stop a nuclear reactor, it's still generating 7% of its power just from the heat. So if you have a reactor that's putting out 1 gigawatt of electricity, it's generating 3 gigawatts of heat to do that. And when you shut it down at that first moment, it's generating 200 megawatts of heat. And that's why you have to keep this thing cool, or it's going to it's going to melt down, as things did at Fukushima. I'm laughing at them having to shift from the Mac to an old Windows machine. Yeah. Shocking, shocking. It's not even a new Windows machine. Okay, so after spending another 4 or 5 years in this pool, it can then be taken out of the pool and shifted into what's called dry cask storage. These are heavily shielded casks. They're at the reactor site. You can put the fuel in it. It's now generating a small enough amount of heat so you don't have to worry about melting the fuel, and you can store it there for 50 years, 100 years, but you'd like to get it out of there and get it into a permanent disposal. Just a little thing for you to think about. If you have a coal-fired power plant, you use 4 million tons of coal for 1 gigawatt of electricity for 1 year. 4 million tons. For nuclear, you use about 1/250,000th of that. Not 4 million tons, you used about 20 tons. So when you think about the waste problem, think about the ash that you have to dispose of from those things. Now, the elements, we'll see whether this thing works for this one. It does. When you think of the spent fuel, think of 3 pieces of it. The biggest piece is uranium. uranium-238, unburnt, unused, its radioactivity is negligible, and the required isolation time is 0. You can take natural uranium and you can hold it in your hands. U-238 has, I think, a 4 billion year lifetime. So the actual radiation you're getting is extraordinarily weak, much weaker than you get from cosmic rays. So if you want to hug your uranium, it's not going to give you much more radiation than you get now. The big radiation problem in intensity is fission fragments. When you get your nuclear power, you're getting this by fissioning the U-235 nucleus and falls apart into other things with a release of energy. Fission fragments make 4% of the spent fuel. Radiation is intense, but it's only 500 years you'd have to put it away. And the problem is the last 1%, which are the long-lived products. And those things are about 1%. Radioactivity is medium, but you got to keep it out of the biosphere for 1 million years. So that's the problem. The million-year part is what you got to worry about. So here you see a slide showing the radioactivity of spent fuel. I don't know how, whoops, no, that's the wrong one. Is this, yeah. So what you see is two things here. You see this thing diving fast. That's the fission fragments. 500 years gets it down to the reference line. I'll come to the reference line in a minute. But when you add in these long-lived things, you get up to hundreds of thousands of years. The reference line is natural uranium. If the world has got loads of natural uranium, so the standard reference line is this thing should be no more hazardous than natural uranium, and that's not unreasonable goal. So here are the rules of the game. These rules are set by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, Congress, and the courts. So spent fuel has to be safely isolated for as long as it's dangerous. That for untreated spent fuel straight out of a reactor is a roughly several 100,000 to 1 million years. It's got to be retrievable for 50 years after replacement. Why? Well, the notion here is that maybe we'll learn something and we'll get more worried about how we dispose of it, or maybe we'll need it for something else because it's still got uranium and it's got other such things in it that can be used again. Now, this is known to be possible that you can isolate this. There is a natural reactor that was discovered in Gabon in Africa at Oklo. It started to burn 1.7 billion years ago. It burned for hundreds of thousands of years, and its long-lived radioactive elements have only moved a very short distance, measured in meters. Why did this thing go off? Well, the lifetime of uranium-238 is shorter than, of uranium-235 is shorter than 238. So if you go back this 1.7 billion years ago, there was 4 times as much uranium-235. So it was up to nearly 3%, and if you get the right amount of water in it to moderate the spectra, it can actually go. So it produced a few 100,000 kilowatts of energy for hundreds of thousands of years, and they didn't go anyplace. So we know in principle it's possible to keep this stuff out of the way. Okay, so now let me give you a bit of history here on the waste disposal program. In 1982, Congress said that spent fuel disposal is a federal responsibility. It set an amount the utilities have to pay, that's the 1/10 of a cent per kilowatt hour, and it tells the Department of Energy, find a site to put this stuff away. Now, what that means is that when it leaves the power plant, title transfers to the federal government, and it's the Fed's responsibility to put it away. It's the utility's responsibility to keep it safely until the feds take it away. There's a controversy there, which I'll come to if time allows. So in 1987, the DOE came back with 3 potential sites, which is what they'd been asked to do by Congress. One of them was in the state of Washington in Granite Rock. One of them was in the state of Texas in a very thick ancient salt bed. And one of them was at Yucca Mountain in Nevada in volcanic tuff. Texas and Washington had lots of political muscle at the time, and they took their states off the table. Nevada got it. Nevada had no say in it. Nevada has no role in regulating it. Nevada just has to, as the Nevadans put it, become the nation's nuclear garbage dump for nothing. Nevada didn't like that, and they've been fighting it ever since. DOE did 20 years of R&D, cost $10 billion to do it. They submitted an application for approval to proceed with the final construction of Yucca Mountain in, I think, 2008. And then things happened. So Yucca Mountain was supposed to open in 1998. The utilities have paid into the waste fund. They have contracts with the DOE. And what the courts have said is, DOE, you signed contracts with these people saying you were going to take this stuff in 1998. You haven't. You have to pay them their costs of continued storage. That's now something like $500,000 to $1 million a year per reactor. There's no problem except money in storing there. The Obama administration withdrew the application to license Yucca Mountain in 2009 and created something called the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future to recommend what to do and how to do it. The Blue Ribbon Commission's report, final report, is due out very soon. Its preliminary report came out, I believe, in early November for public comment. It had 60 days of public comment. They then checked those and finalized the report. Final report is due out January 29th, which is the end of this week, I believe. So on the spent fuel issue, there's a big political component and a much smaller technical one. Other countries have used a consent-based system to site their nuclear waste disposal facilities. Sweden, Finland, and France, for a specific example. The Blue Ribbon Commission recommends that the United States switch to a consent-based system. Now, almost nobody seems to talk about what's called the Waste Isolation Pilot Project, which is a repository near Carlsbad, New Mexico, where we are currently putting away spent fuel for hundreds of thousands of years. That was a consent-based system. The state of New Mexico has all sorts of rights in overseeing the environmental issues. There has to be agreement on all sorts of environmental issues. And I'm going to come back to this in a little while. So here we are, basically about to start over, but starting over, we have not only our own experience to go on, but we have the experience of the French, the Swedes, and the Finns on how to do this right. Yes, sir?
Would you define consent-based system, please, or will you?
Consent-based systems means that the location has to agree. Okay, so when you wanted to site the Waste Isolation Pilot Project, shorthand it's called WIP. To site WIP, the state of New Mexico had to agree that WIPP would go in New Mexico, and the price of agreement in the negotiations was that the state and the locality would have a role in the environmental monitoring and setting the rules on transportation and all that sort of stuff. So this seems to be a secret that we in fact have a geological repository in Carlsbad, New Mexico. Now, before I show you it, I want to show you once again the spent fuel issue. If you look at that curve, you see the upper curve is the totality of it, but you see the fission fragments die very soon. Some of the long-lived components actually build up from the decay of other long-lived components. One of the bad guys has a lifetime of about 2,000 years, and that decays into something with a lifetime of many hundreds of thousands of years. That's this thing building up. There are others with very long lifetimes too, and if you want to read the labels, I'm leaving all these slides and the notes pages with the course, and anybody who wants to can happily go look at them. So what are we trying to dispose of? This is a used fuel assembly from a pressurized water reactor. It's about 14 feet long. It's from the floor to the ceiling here, but it's only about 9 inches square. And inside that thing are 200 tubes. Each one of those tubes is about the size of a pencil. And inside those tubes are little slugs of enriched uranium that are about so long and fit in those tubes. That's called a fuel assembly. And when you take the fuel out of the reactor, you take a whole assembly out just like that, and you put that assembly in the cooling pool just like that, and natural convection circulates the water. It doesn't need any pumps to run it. It just needs water there. And the big worry about the cooling ponds at Fukushima was not that they had no power to circulate water. It's that something had happened to crack those ponds and the water had leaked away. It turns out that that wasn't true. It didn't leak out. And so the fuel in the cooling ponds is not what melted at Fukushima. What melted was the fuel in the reactor where the water did get away. So that's it. It weighs 1,400 pounds. Boiling water reactors are a little bit smaller than that, but that's what we got. And every year in the United States, 2,000 tons of spent fuel come out, 20 tons per reactor per gigawatt year. Now, where was it going to be put? This is Yucca Mountain. It is, as the kids would say, it is a yucky site. It's high desert. There's no water there, very dry. It's quite lovely if you like that kind of desert scenery. One of the rationales that people use as an excuse to shove this down Nevada's throat was that this is also the site of the old nuclear weapons test site. So there have been lots of little bomb tests that went off underground, and at the test site there are already pockets of radioactive material that you're worried about. However, all the bombs that went off in all the tests ever done at that test site are equivalent to the spent fuel produced in our reactors in 2 weeks. So this is a very different kettle of fish. 2 weeks, 26 times as much per year, 60-year lifetime for the reactor. So you're talking about roughly on the order of more than 1,000 times the material being put away in this geological repository. Okay, so now what goes on underground? Underground comes an array of tunnels that are built in. This whole thing starts 1,000 feet below the surface and roughly 1,000 feet above the water table in that region. The notion here is that you truck in the spent fuel from the main tunnel, and then you bring it into one of these side tunnels, and you bore the side tunnels as you need them. You fill them up. There's a limit to how much you can put in a side tunnel, which depends on the heat generated by the still radioactive fuel. You can't have too much or you damage the rocks nearby. That sets the limit on it. And after 50 years, you seal that tunnel. So you're going on loading things into more and more tunnels. Now, the limit on Yucca Mountain set by Congress is 60,000 tons of civilian spent fuel. That's only half of what you get from the present generation of reactors. The geological limit, my geologist friends tell me, is about a factor of 4 more than that. You could go and put in more layers of such tunnels. Whether you're going to change it or not, if nuclear stays big, eventually you're going to have more than one reactors. So I think that it was a bad mistake not to balance the waste disposal site in Nevada with some benefit to the state of Nevada. Our government, the feds, generate all sorts of very expensive civilian projects which have lots of good jobs, and they're put down in various places in the country. And if they'd put down a few of them in Nevada, the opposition might not have been so strong. I have to confess to a little self-interest here. I tried to convince the government that the next giant American accelerator should go in Nevada. And if you gave them this $15 billion accelerator project, maybe they wouldn't object to Yucca Mountain. So now what's going on? Let me go to the Swedes now. They're different from Yucca. They decided to put theirs in crystalline rock. It goes in granite. Okay, and here's this I got from their website. So you start off with a fuel rod. You go to a fuel assembly. The fuel assembly goes first into a ductile iron device, and that is put into a copper cylinder, because copper is better at resisting corrosion than the ductile iron. And that then goes down underground into a side tunnel bored in this, and then you bore a hole in the floor of the tunnel, and you put this cylinder in, and when you want to close it all up, you pack it with bentonite clay. What's magic about bentonite clay? The chemistry is such that the mobility of the stuff that you worry about in that is extremely small. So it doesn't matter if cask fails. If the cask fails, the stuff comes out, but the clay blocks it. It moves at millimeters per millennium. And so there's enough of it so it's not going to really go anyplace. So on the last one, you can see this better on this one. You see what the Swedes are planning. The thing is very deep. It starts a couple of thousand feet deep. It's partly under land and it's partly under the sea next to Sweden. They did a bunch of test borings. I was down in one of them about 10 years ago. And, you know, it's interesting. They did a terrific job. here's their time cycle. They started in 1990 looking at feasibility studies. And by the way, the Swedes also had a period when they were going to phase out nuclear power. But they were stuck, like my earlier slide, love it or hate it, they had it. So they have to do something with this, and so they've been working on this since 1990. They did various site investigations between 2000 and 2010. They asked for proposals from various municipalities. They got 7 of them. These are regions that wanted to be the site. They brought that down to 2, spent a lot more time with the 2, and eventually, chose the one that they're in, and it's expected that it will start getting spent fuel in the year 2020. Finland has basically followed Sweden. They're essentially doing the same thing. The concept was developed by Swedes. The Finns are also using crystalline rock. They also use the fuel package, the ductile iron, the copper cask, the bentonite clay, all the rest of that. So that is basically the same thing. France is going to do something different. France is going to dispose of theirs in alkaline clay. They've only done experiments. They haven't started to build this thing yet. But they have the site selected, and they have the agreement of the locals that the locals are happy with the site, and when they're ready to start disposing, they are going to be able to do it because there is acceptance of this. They have things that are vitrified into glass logs, and those glass logs go into the repository, and they have a very long lifetime. And in alkaline clay, the corrosion of the glass logs is extremely small. It's sort of nanometers per year. So you can go a very long time before much is done. Now, ours, WIP, is in salt. Salt bed is the bed of an ancient sea. It starts 2,000 feet underground, and it's 2,000 feet thick. And into that, we go and we put military waste. Waste isolation pilot project is for military waste. Now, military waste has got certain properties which make it easier to handle than the civilian, but not that much easier. It's still got to be put away for hundreds of thousands of years. So in WIP, I'll get this right eventually. On the surface, you have the treatment things, and then you go way underground and you drill a tunnel in this salt. It's easy. You use fire hoses to make your tunnels in salt. And you know that this has been water-free for a very long time, because if there was any water in there, the salt wouldn't be there. It'd be all dissolved. So this salt bed is tens of millions of years old. Some say it's 100 million, some say it's 30 million. Whatever it is, it's been around a very long time. And they are actually putting in the long-lived stuff starting in 2007. They started putting the thing together in 1999. They had all sorts of things to learn about the best ways to drill the holes and all that sort of stuff. But WIP is taking spent fuel right now. It's also being used for science projects. In fact, Stanford has a physics project in one of the WIP tunnels. It's something that wants very low background and looks for an extremely rare decay mode of a radioactive material. It's called neutrinoless double beta decay. Important physics has nothing to do with nuclear waste disposal, But it was very nice of the WIP people to give the physics department and SLAC people access to that. Now, the state and the locals in New Mexico have said they are interested in being the site of the civilian repository. The Texas site that was originally identified in the 1987 DOE study has also said it's interested in being it. Now, this is more than just casual conversation. I've seen the resolution from the New Mexico state senator, which has a zillion whereases, and the meat comes after it says, therefore we wish to be considered as the site for the future civilian radioactive waste repository. So, the BRC recommendations. Now, as I said, the final isn't out yet. The comments are going to be about mechanisms, I believe, not about the main theses and the main policy recommendations. They're going to stay. I know that because I have a good friend who's on the BRC. He hasn't told me the details, but he told me that that's all right. So it's going to say focus on granite, clay, or salt. We know a lot more now than we knew in 1987. And it turns out, based on the work done at Yucca Mountain, that it's harder to do this at a volcanic tuff site than it is in granite, clay, or salt. Not that you can't do it. It's harder and more expensive. So they say focus on granite, clay, or salt. Negotiate an agreement with the state and the locality. Set up a semi-private company to develop and manage the project. Give the state a large financial incentive. Take Congress out of the loop on spending from the Waste Disposal Fund. Congress never approved the requested R&D money for Yucca Mountain. They always cut the budget, and so the Yucca Mountain R&D program always went slower than it was. Now, this turns out to be tricky now. There's all of the mysteries of budget scoring. Right now, the Nuclear Waste Fund comes in and it's considered Treasury income. It's owed to the disposal of nuclear waste, so it should go out. But Congress controls how fast it goes out. So if all of a sudden it starts going out faster, or it's not under Congress's control, there's all sorts of problem about scoring. The semi-private company to develop and manage the project. This is a notion to set up something like the TVA. TVA was originally set up as a semi-private company to develop electricity resources in the Tennessee Valley. It worked very well. It did a good job. It had oversight where things were reported to Congress, but Congress didn't control the progress. Give the state a large financial incentive. The Nuclear Waste Fund takes in approximately $2 billion a year now. The BRC, although they don't have anything specific, they're talking about the states getting something between $100 and $200 million a year to be used on agreed purposes. Could use for education in the state, for other environmental uses in the state. You can't just blow it on big parties for the governor, but to be used for agreed upon things. And think of what happened if California had that, and you could use that money to reduce UC's tuition by a lot. It might be quite a sweet little deal. And take Congress out of the loop so that the thing will go at a reasonable pace, and the pace will not be determined by Congress's willingness to spend the money that was paid in to do this, but which they want to use for other purposes. Now, there's an alternative to disposing of the plutonium and minor actinides, and those are the things that make you need to keep this stuff for 1 million years. The bottom one is what we've been talking about, the geological answer. Dispose of it safely and immobilize it somehow or other. There's a nuclear answer that's being researched. This is not ready for prime time yet. So you use nuclear reactors to burn the long-lived stuff that is responsible for the requirement to isolate it for many hundreds of thousands of years. That doesn't get you away from the need for a repository. If you get all of it out, you're on this line and you've got to isolate it for at least 500 years. And for 500 years, well, you should be pretty comfortable. The Egyptian pyramids could isolate a tomb for 7,000 years. We ought to be able to do 500 or 1,000 years without much trouble and without much worrying. If you take out these two other curves, give you what you need to do. If you take out none of it or you take out all of it, and if you take out all of the minor actinides, you get this. If you take out most of them, you get that. And there you're talking about 10,000 years. And if you do nothing, you're talking about your 100,000s of years. How do you do this sort of thing? Well, as I say, it's not ready for prime time yet. Let me just look down here. Right now, what we're doing in the geological one is we burn it in a light water reactor, and then we take it straight into a repository. The notion here is that you will take the bad stuff out of this, and you'll put it in what's called a fast spectrum reactor, and you'll recycle it, and you'll burn it all up. And so what goes into the repository is fission fragments and all that stuff here, and the outcome of the multiple recycle at the end of the line, and then you end up with something, I'm going to call it, for 1,000-year storage required, and you don't have to do all the rest of it. There's a cost issue. Nobody has an idea what this costs. It hasn't been developed and tested. It's, let me call it, a gleam in the eye right now. There are issues about proliferation of nuclear weapons. If everybody goes around separating all the plutonium from this very nasty, highly radioactive fission fragment stuff, will they get it away? France, Japan, China, Russia, and India are all committed to developing these fast spectrum reactors and deploying them by 2050 and trying to get on this route. Will this route work out? I don't know. We'll have to see. Nobody's going to know that for another 40 years. But meantime, love it or hate it, we have it, and we've got to do something with the stuff we have now. And if you want to read more, there are a few references for people who'd like to go further. And with that, that's the end of my story, and we're underground. Thank you all.
Okay, questions? Okay, yeah, right up there.
Thank you very much for coming. Like information
Talk
about
loud.
Thank you for coming. What do you think about our types of disposal? Like you said nothing about boreholes, for example. So what do you think about our research in this area?
What he's talking about, boreholes are a different type of geological disposal. What you do is you drill a hole in the ground which goes down many kilometers underground, far below the water table, and you put these fuel casks down this borehole. You've got to drill a hole that's about so big around to do it, and drilling down that deep is quite expensive. There are people who advocate that. There is study going on about it. There is no conclusion yet. And the question is, which is going to cost the least and which do you have the greatest confidence in? I think we're pretty certain about the crystalline rock, the granite, the salt, and the alkaline clay. And the borehole's a new idea originally developed to dispose of plutonium. Now, plutonium, weapons plutonium, is not very radioactive, so you never had to worry about that. You just had to worry about keeping it out of the biosphere, and so you didn't have heat or anything else to worry about. I don't think the borehole thing, personally, is going to work unless you separate things and use the boreholes for those long-lived parts that don't generate a lot of heat. But people are still working on this, and I don't know what the conclusion is going to be.
Okay, next. Okay, well, let's go up here, and then we'll go back over there. Yep.
Dr. Panofsky and disposition of weapons fission material. And they made one statement in there that using the plutonium cycle, you could mine about 100 times more energy from the original uranium. Would that be an incentive for them to pursue this act?
The question is, do you need to get more energy out of the natural uranium than you get with this normal power reactor cycle? There's been a concern that you'd run out of fuel and you had to move to what's called a breeder reactor. One of the things that you can do with the uranium-238 is when you get the fissions, if you do the reactor right, you can get neutron capture on the 238 and produce plutonium. And the plutonium is a very good fuel for power reactors. So instead of just using the 0.7% of U-235, you now can make more stuff out of the U-238. These are called breeder reactors. They're fast spectrum reactors. And the question is, do you need them or not? You may want fast spectrum reactors to burn up this bast stuff and make it easier to dispose of fuel. You may want breeder reactors if you're going to run out of nuclear fuel. Are you going to run out of enough natural uranium? That is an interesting issue. Personally, if you look at the history of mining, we go and we mine, if you're talking about anything, lower and lower concentration ores, and it never costs more than the higher concentration ores because you develop more sophisticated mining systems. And there's a huge amount of uranium at lower concentrations than we mine now. Now we mine at concentrations of several thousand parts per million. There are 15 million tons of that. There's a zillion tons of this stuff at less. This is a question which is not yet settled. I'll give you my personal feeling. My personal feeling is there's lots of uranium. And if you go to these fast spectrum reactors, you're going to do it because you want to simplify the waste disposal system. But we're going to see as we go on. For either reason, there are countries working on fast spectrum reactors. We have done some, but we've stopped that work. We may be starting it again. But as I say, China, India, Russia, Japan are all working on R&D to develop these fast spectrum reactors.
Okay, yep, you in the blue, yep.
Yes, Professor Richter, thank you. That was an excellent summary. I'm an earth scientist and I was on the board on radioactive management for 3 years, so a lot of this is familiar. My question is related to the fact that by shutting down Yucca Mountain, we've made a choice, but I don't think the American public was ever made aware of the choice. And the choice is we decided the risk is less to store things at 72 reactor sites around the country, most of which are in river floodplains, A lot of the waste is in dry casks now, but we saw in Fukushima, if you don't think broadly about what the natural hazards can be, you can be very surprised. So by making this choice and even restarting at a new site, we're still pushing the problem 20 years down the road. And meanwhile, the American public is living with a choice they were never even made aware of they were making, or their decision makers were making for them.
I left out one of the recommendations of the Blue Ribbon Commission. The recommendation is that you go to regional storage facilities, so that you take this stuff in the dry casks and you move it to a few regional storage facilities around the country, 3, 4 such things, instead of, I think it's 60 or 70 reactor sites that we have now, each of which has its thing. Now, is the dry cask storage okay? I think it's probably all right. I think you ask good questions. I don't know whether the NRC has done a systematic review of all of those. I know, for example, at the California nuclear power plants, one of them is essentially right at sea level, but all its dry casks are up on a bluff. So they're not worried about getting even Fukushima-sized tsunamis to drown them out. And once in the dry casks, they don't need any power, and they don't need any water, and they just sit there. Now, in a violent earthquake, is anything going to happen to them? Well, if they fall over and roll downhill, we're in trouble. If they just fall over, I don't think we're in trouble. That is an issue, and as I said, the BRC makes a recommendation, and the recommendation is to get them away. I think the highest priority is to get them away from shut down nuclear power plants. The active nuclear power plants, there's a lot of people around and a lot of guards and all sorts of stuff because of running nuclear power plant. In these shut down facilities, the only thing there is a few people and this spent reactor fuel, and that's the ones that I would worry about. I would like to see those all first moved at least to some working power plant, and better moved to some regional storage facility. I agree with you.
There was a study we uncovered by DOE looking at the risk, and they set some threshold of potential lives lost. And the study ran looking at, continued storage on site and considering all the various natural hazards. And they quickly exceeded their threshold number of deaths or exposure limits. I don't remember the exact details, and the study was never completed because they so quickly ran out of, hit the threshold. So it's an issue they're aware of, but it's never discussed.
Okay.
So Gordon, how about you next?
Would you care to comment on Germany's decision to abandon nuclear energy?
Sorry?
Would you care to comment on Germany's decision?
Germany has decided for the third time on a phase-out related to nuclear energy. The first phase-out was after Fukushima, when they were going to phase out all their nuclear power plants. The second phase-out was about 10 years later, when they phased out the first phase-out. The third phase-out happened after Fukushima, when they decided once again to phase out nuclear power. Now, I think that this is, it's political. It's not anything rational, because where are they going to get their electricity? They're going to get some of it from France, which generates most of it by nuclear power, and they're going to get the rest of it from Poland and Czechoslovakia, where they generate it from coal. Now, because of the way the Kyoto Protocol is written, the people who get charged for emissions are the people who produce the electricity, not the people who use it. So it turns out that Poland and Czechoslovakia are well below their allotment. So it's okay to run their emissions up, and it doesn't hurt Germany's target. But fundamentally, it's a political thing. The Greens have a lot more political power in the German system than they do most places. And to keep her coalition going, Chancellor Merkel decided on phase out number 3.
We have time for one more question. And any students who want to ask a question, like kind of a priority? Students, come on. No? Okay, yes, you're last. Sorry for the rest of you, Bert's up here.
Could you speak about the implications of some natural disaster at the storage facility? What are the safety precautions they're taking there?
Sorry, I didn't hear it. What did he say?
Safety precautions at nuclear facilities if something goes wrong. Is that
At the Yucca Mountain.
Oh, at Yucca Mountain.
At a storage facility. I mean, if there was an earthquake at this location, what would that mean?
Well, the notion here is that you design for certain things and you build in a conservatism above the design level. If you look at Fukushima, the earthquake didn't do it, and even though the earthquake was much bigger than the standard design earthquake the tsunami did it in. So you over-design and over-engineer your thing, and once it's underground and the tunnels are backfilled and it's sealed off, they're supposed to be just sitting there, and earthquakes are not going to do anything to them. One of the safest places to be in an earthquake is in an underground tunnel, because what happens is the earth moves and the tunnel moves with it. And so nothing happens. When we had the 1987 Loma Prieta earthquake, we had a guy working down in the slack tunnel, and he said he could see the deformation of the tunnel with walls coming at him where he was, moving this way and that way, and passing down, and no damage. So being underground in an earthquake is a good thing, and all I can say is that the big concern is what happens when the casks fail, and if you're talking about 1 million years, they're going to fail, and does this stuff get loose, and how does it migrate? That's the focus.
Okay, one announcement. So Rod Ewing is going to be here on Thursday and Friday. He studies nuclear fuel disposal issues, and I don't have, is there, Gordon, do you know? 2 lectures, okay.
In GES and Geology Corner, I think, and the one at CSAC.
Okay, all right, so
That's
Thursday and
February the
Friday.
2nd and 3rd.
Okay, and Pi will,
Sorry, next week, this week. They're this week.
It's this week.
That's
yeah.
this week.
Yeah.
Thursday and Friday of this week.
Thursday and Friday of this week. One sort of more on regulatory policy issues, one on the science side about waste forms, I believe. So,
What happened at Yucca Mountain? The other one is the policy issues.
okay. So anyway, with that, thank you so much for an excellent lecture. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.